Hi, I'm Christina Bowers, and I teach advanced biology and environmental studies to 11th and 12th graders at Meridian World School in Round Rock, Texas. Now, science can be a class that intimidates students, that excludes students, and that students early on screen themselves out of for a whole wide variety of reasons. And so I'd like to share some strategies and approaches for science teachers, but these are also broadly applicable to all teachers who are striving for equity and student agency in their classroom. So, first of all, I start with the premise that every student in my class is capable of engaging in and learning about complex science. And my goal, of course, is for students to be able to discuss their ideas. First of all, to have ideas and develop their own ideas, and then share those with their peers. Now, this year, teaching during the pandemic, I and educators all over the place have dealt with confronting this giant vacuum that I'm going to call Zoom silence. Many students have their cameras off. When you go to breakout rooms, you can't assume that students are actually talking and engaging with one another. And in terms of practically teaching students strategies for engagement, I can't say to my Zoom students, how will you show me that you're listening, right? Because I can't see them. Many of them have their cameras off. So what I'd like to do today is share some strategies that I have found useful for engaging students in the Zoom. Now, first of all, I was trying to understand why so many of my students would be unwilling to share ideas when they returned from the breakout room. And so recently I asked them the question on a quiz, please select the option that best describes you. And this is one example, one representative classroom. In other classrooms, I actually had even more students share this idea that I am virtual and I want to talk in the breakout room, but others are typically not talking. And so my initial reaction was, well, this should be so easy to deal with. But then on reflection, I thought maybe they're not quiet because they're disengaged. Maybe they're quiet because they actually need some strategies. And so what I'd like to do is share some talk moves with you, some strategies that you can introduce your students to improve their engagement in the Zoom. And this can also filter over into your students who are face-to-face. And so really this is about routines for thinking together. And you can invite your students in the breakout rooms to share ideas. And I actually approach my students in the classroom as though they are one breakout room. You might invite one Zoom breakout room to engage with your class group and then have a small group conversing with each other. But again, you need to sort of give them some routines. So one of the things that I have found useful is actually providing students with sentence stems or modeling for them ways that they can give feedback to one another. For example, if they have a different idea, they might say, here's a new idea to consider. They might ask for clarification. You know, we really want to introduce students to strategies or routines that help them listen more deeply to one another, because this, of course, opens the door for them to reflect on their own ideas. And so I differ with the part where you said blank and here's why is a great sentence stem to engage with students on or to provide students with when they are going to give feedback to their peers. So ultimately, I find that it's really important to give students pretty clear objectives and goals. And specifically in the breakout room, if you have 6 kids in a great breakout room, or 5 or 6, make sure and give each person a very clearly defined role. So the manager can basically be the person who ensures that every voice is heard. So if there's somebody in the Zoom who's quiet, you can talk about why that student might be quiet and provide the manager with some tools for how they might invite the student who's being quiet to share their ideas. And it could happen in the chat, or it could happen, for example, on Jamboard with a sticky note. The spokesperson is the person assigned who's going to share out with the whole group when they come back. So there's a bit of reduction in anxiety. Students then aren't really being afraid of who's going to get called on because they know the spokesperson has that job. The record keeper writes things down. Strategy analyst is a very specialized role, and this is the student who's going to explore the solutions or the ideas and provide their insight, maybe ask some guiding questions to the whole group. Quality control is the person who makes sure that everyone is in agreement, that what is on the record is what everyone agreed to. And then again, the librarian, this is the person whose task it is to go find other resources. Sometimes I only have 2 or 3 in a group. Sometimes I have 5 or 6. It really depends on the task. And so you can tailor your goals to the number of students that you have. But again, very important is setting norms and establishing expectations. So I really like this resource or this tool called the Discussion Diamond, and I got this from Carrie Wingert at the University of Washington. And in this, you sort of approach, I adapted this for Jamboard in a way that you could do if you were sort of rotating stations around a lab or a classroom with tables. And so the way this works is here. So the idea is nobody gets off the hook. So if you have a group of 4, each person gets 1 quadrant and they put their idea down. They can choose how they communicate their idea. They can draw, they can put symbols, they can diagram. And in the end, everybody looks at each other's ideas and they try to find some common ground, which they then put in the center diamond. And this can then be shared out in the whole group. Some other strategies, again, using Jamboard that I like are, for example, using structured peer feedback with sticky notes. Now, if you were on a regular table, you could actually physically have sticky notes and ask students to do this. So the idea here is that if the students have a model or some sort of a concept that they've put together, you can ask them to either add an idea, revise an idea, remove an idea, or add a new question. Okay, so for example, you could rotate, and that way everyone gets at least 4 pieces of peer feedback to allow them to revise their model. So one example is that I have is my students were exploring the role of nutrient runoff in various types of environments. So it might be a lake, a river, that kind of thing. And one of my students actually had drawn birds on their model, and another student asked, are the birds a part of your model? Are they impacted by the runoff, or did you just draw them? And so the student suggested perhaps you could remove the birds from your model, and it kind of invites the students to think more intentionally about why they're including what they're including in their actual models. Now, in a blended learning classroom, students might engage with a playlist. Not everybody watches the same exact videos or engages with the same exact resources, but you do want to be able to bring everyone back together around your learning objectives for the course. And so having these sort of whole class discussions are really important for that. Now, I like to invite students to choose what they feel compelled to provide in the way of feedback. For example, they might have had a really strong opinion about something that they learned, and so they're going to share an opinion. They might share something new. Now, the idea here is that everybody shares something. It might be a connection to something they learned in another class. Our students in French were actually learning about ugly fruit and how there are certain companies and businesses that are aimed at supplying consumers with the fruit that would have otherwise been discarded. And I teach environmental studies, and so in my class, the students were learning about food waste, and it was a really natural connection. And so it's always really exciting when your student makes a connection to another class that they're learning about. You can use these Jamboards to facilitate student individual reflection. For example, you could ask, find someone who had a different opinion than you on that video, and then ask them, do you now want to revise your opinion? Why or why not? And so you want it to be open-ended. You don't want it just to be a yes or no question. So you want students to sort of justify their position. Find someone whose perspective you are curious about and ask them a clarifying question. And so this can lead to some really rich and interesting class discussions. And then finally, in a classroom, when we're really sort of focusing on equity and equitable practices, academic language can screen kids out of a lot of engagement with science. And so I try really hard not to make assumptions about what students do and do not understand. So for example, what do we mean when we say patterns and trends? And then here's a great one, observation versus inference. And so I use Jamboard for this. So here what we have is an example of some data from a paper. And this is a biointeractive resource. And I invite my students to write down all their observations. What's important here is that you color code observation versus inference. So there's a visual cue, and have students put their initials on their responses. So again, nobody's off the hook, everybody gets to engage. And another thing that I have done on this specific question, observation versus inference, is I invite students to come up with their own example. And I ask them, well, who would your target audience be? If you were going to teach your grandmother what an observation versus an inference is, what would be a good example of that? And so they can build that out on a Jamboard. Observations and inferences are important in many different science fields. And so here's an age structure diagram from environmental studies. And I invite students to describe exactly what they see. And it sort of encourages a deep look, and that can often then lead to the questions. I wonder why, for example, there's an indentation here on the right side in the females, but not on the left. Not as much on the left. So always important is that students put their initials so that you can track their responses. And then some sort of final thoughts about this is you want to give students time to think. And I'm an impatient educator, so I'm always like, it's really hard for me to sit and be patient with silence. But as it turns out, increasing your wait time from 1.5 seconds to 3 seconds actually has a really strong and palpable impact on students responding. It might give students who are a bit hesitant the chance to gain the confidence to actually put their idea out there. But that 1.5 seconds makes a difference. So in your mind, as a teacher, I do this, think to yourself, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, like give yourself that time and try to become comfortable with the silence. And then finally, don't assume students know how to do what they need to do. Give them specific routines and ideas to scaffold peer feedback and their idea sharing. And then finally, ask them how they're doing. And so, you might find that they are sitting in the breakout room and it's actually more quiet than you realize. Ultimately, by engaging in practices that support a safe space where student ideas are welcomed and students don't feel, where everybody feels that, first of all, if you establish the expectation that everybody's going to put an idea out there, then nobody's off the hook and all ideas are welcome. And of course, my goal in a science classroom is to ultimately support students in understanding that anybody can do science. And hopefully, by providing examples of researchers and scientists, that they might see themselves reflected in those engagements. So good luck implementing your blended learning classroom. I invite you to join in the fun. It is absolutely an impactful change that you can implement, and you will find that your students are more engaged and your discussions go a lot deeper. So I hope these resources are helpful to you, and that's all I've got. Thank you.